Here we've got a couple of splendid cock pheasants. But what, you might ask, have they got to do with mice in the cavity wall of a house? And what have these mice, in turn, got to do with a squirrel enjoying a nut in the park, getting food in for the winter? Rabbits, young rabbits, sharing a secret. How do you connect them with another animal? A frog calling to its mate. Well, the answer is that they're some of the invaders. Hello again. Well, these furred and feathered and fishy invaders are going to be our subject this week, and there are a surprising number of them roaming loose in Britain. Animals of all sorts which are so familiar to us because they're common animals in the countryside and in towns, so common that we've really got, in many cases, too many of them. And what you'd never realize is that they're not British animals at all. Some of them came in many years ago, some very recently, but they all came from foreign lands. It all started when man first made huts for himself and began growing crops around them. The crops automatically attracted the invaders. Man fed on the crops, and so did the new arrivals. One of the very first to come in was a very familiar animal to all of us. It was the little house mouse. Now, the house mouse came in on crusader ships from the southern part of Asia, from Russia, and indeed it spread in ship's cargoes all over the world, and practically everywhere it went, it did well. Invaders always seem to do well. They adapt so fast. The design of houses was adapting too. And mice soon found out, when they looked around and they were resourceful enough, that people were now leaving little grills in the walls of houses which made a perfect front door. And an enterprising mouse could get straight into the cavity wall. Then it had the whole run of the house, warm and snug and completely free from predators. Here they could breed, raise their families. This was a base for a mouse. From here, the mice could go anywhere into the house. They may be dirty, they may be unhygienic, but they're most endearing little animals. And they're effective enough to get a lot of grown-ups up on chairs. And it's not just the kitchen and the larder where a mouse will look around. Any house mouse worth its salt will find food in the most unexpected places. They've learnt to go everywhere, not just in houses, but through factories, warehouses, grain stores. They've even learnt to live in refrigeration ships and in cold stores in sub-zero temperatures, and breed there too. British through and through, you'd think, the house sparrow. But it's not, it's another invader. In America, they even call it the British sparrow. But it came here, it came from Africa originally, perhaps before the house mouse did. But it spread through the land, but only where there are people, in cities and around farms. There are so many that you'd easily think that a sparrow is our commonest bird. There are plenty that you don't see quite so often because they're out in the countryside that are more numerous. Blackbirds, chaffinches, other birds like that, but every day of our lives we see a house sparrow, and we rejoice when we see them. There are few public parks anywhere in Britain where you won't see them. And the secret of their success is that they've learnt to live with man, and they've learnt that man throws out a lot of rubbish. Rubbish to eat and shelter. They've learnt how to look after themselves. You see what I mean? So far, we've looked at animals that have got in, invaded, without any deliberate help from man. Now I want you to meet a different category, the Houdinis, the escapers. Now, they were brought in to stay in captivity for zoos and fur farms and parks, and they've got out and made good on the loose. Here's a good example. This is a little muntjac, a small deer from China, which has done well in the South Midlands of England. There are a few of these prickly Himalayan porcupines have got loose and done quite well. Up in the Pennines and parts of the south, Australian wallabies. Even up here, this old chap behind me is a koipu, escaped from fur farms, and he's now well established in the Norfolk Broads. Those big reed beds are exactly what he was looking for. Well, the koipu came from South America, but this mink here came from Labrador, Hudson's Bay area of Canada. For fur farms, mink farms. That's the standard colour, but they bred them in these fur farms, all different colours together. What they didn't realise, though, at the time, was that a mink is a bit of a Houdini. I've no doubt that this cage was billed in the catalogue as being guaranteed mink-proof. But mink have proved themselves to be very enterprising indeed. It wasn't long before they got out into the wild, all over the land, and did well there. At first, people didn't bother much. I think they felt that they'd lost their hunting skills and they'd soon come to a sticky end. But the mink thought otherwise. The mink in its own land is a natural-born hunter, a very resourceful animal. And they soon made good, and they soon multiplied. Mink can swim like an otter. They even look a little bit like an otter underwater. This mink is on the River Torridge in North Devon, where the story Tarka the Otter was written. You can't blame the mink for destroying otters, as some people do. The fact is that otters were lost through pollution and a great deal of human thoughtlessness. But because the mink have taken over, it's very difficult for the otters to make a comeback. A brood of very engaging mink kittens tucked away under the riverbank. But it has to be said, mink are not one of the most welcome of our animal invaders. They are a nuisance. They tend to base themselves by rivers and work out from there, killing a tremendous lot of fish and waterfowl. But they'll break into hen houses and go mad as foxes will, killing chickens and then back to the river again. But there's always something that you can say in favour of every animal. Mink are very good rat hunters. I've got a couple of little characters for you to meet now. These are toads, both invaders. This little one here is a midwife toad, and it's an interesting thing because the male of this looks after the eggs after they've been laid right up to the time that they hatch. This big one that's in the box admiring his portrait, that's an African clawed toad. And if I took the lid off, it would jump right out, and that would show you exactly how animals escape into the wild. But the interesting thing about that was that until very recently they were used for pregnancy testing. Now all that is done by chemicals, so the toads were let go, and they did very well. It's extraordinary how many of these introduced animals seem to do even better than they did in their original homelands, and that's certainly true of the grey squirrel. We were a little bit silly to bring this in. It happened in 1820, and there was another introduction shortly after. It came from America and has done incredibly well in the forest lands over Britain. It was thought to be an attractive little addition, an attractive animal to have around in private parks. Well, it is. But it didn't displace this red one, as a lot of people say. The red one died of a virus disease in 1904 to 14, was practically wiped out in the home counties of England. But the grey squirrel took its place, it filled the vacuum. Now the big, strong grey squirrels are there, and these red ones will never get back into those areas at all. Young squirrels have to be one of the most attractive little animals to look at that they are, here in the hole in the tree, the summer nest. That's the trouble with them. You forgive them so much because they're so nice to look at and so beautiful to watch. No, whether we like it or not, we've got to admit that the grey squirrel is a highly successful invader. Successful on many accounts. Its damage is plenty. Damage to trees, young birds, eggs. But I think the damage is felt more because this little animal has learnt to lose a lot of its fear of man and learnt to become an adventurer. It's no good expecting a squirrel to know that the food was put out for the birds. Oh, the real problem of squirrels lies in the forest itself, amongst the trees. Now, it's right under the bark of the tree where the life of the tree is. This is where the sugars, the sap, the minerals are rising, where its new growth is taking place. But these same saps and sugars and minerals will nourish a squirrel just as well as the tree, but at the tree's expense. Damage like this is going to disfigure that tree for good. If it goes all the way around and becomes ring-barked, the chances are it'll die. But even if it's disfigured, it's lost its value to the timber merchant, and it looks horrible. To look up in woodland and see ring-barked branches dead, you know that a squirrel has done it. I suppose at least we can count ourselves lucky that the animal that's doing all this damage is at least very beautiful to look at. Now, when the Romans invaded Britain, they brought in various animals for food. The pheasant was one of them. They also brought in the fat, or edible dormouse, one of their favourite delicacies of all. And they brought in a frog, the edible frog from Europe. But what may surprise you is that they also brought in the rabbit. And the rabbit must have become one of the commonest mammals in the land. It spread everywhere. Another of these success stories. The Romans kept them in hutches, just as we know them now. In fact, when the Romans left, the practice of keeping rabbits went on in the same sort of way. But when the Black Death came along in the 1300s, it's believed that people couldn't keep them up. So many people died in the country that the rabbits went loose and reached the situation that they're in today. If it hadn't been for the myxomatosis in the 50s, the whole country would be overrun with rabbits. And it's the way of rabbits wherever they go. No matter what land they go to, they just multiply. They're even on oceanic islands right out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And then they brought in this handsome frog, the edible frog from Europe, still a great delicacy in France. And they escaped in the south of England into ditches like this. They didn't multiply fast because the climate's a little bit colder, but there are still a few around in the south of England. And if you're lucky, you'll see them and you'll hear them calling to their mate, blowing up their vocal sacs. The sad thing, though, is that where these invaders have settled in, our native frogs have all gone. These big chaps have just eaten up the tadpoles of the smaller ones. The most intriguing of the Roman imports was the edible dormouse. These they brought in and they reared them in beech and oak groves. Then they put them into earthenware pots and fed them delicious things like currants and chestnuts. Sometimes they got so fat in the pots that the pots had to be broken to get the little dormouse out. And then they cooked them in a sauce of honey and poppy seeds, or stuffed them with mincemeat and pepper and pine kernels. Well, that original population has all gone now. They were re-imported, though, in 1902, and you still might see one in Hertfordshire or Buckinghamshire. The only bird that the Romans brought over was the pheasant, and very welcome it was, too. The original home of the pheasant was the far eastern part of Asia. But they did well here, as they've done well everywhere. There's the hen bird with the young. The original one that they brought over became known as the Old English black-necked pheasant. It was a dark bird, black all the way down the neck. Later, the Chinese ones were brought in. There are Chinese now, the Chinese ring-necked pheasant, with a smart white ring on it. They've been bred here ever since as game birds and for the table, and they've done extremely well. There are pheasants now in the United States of America, in New Zealand, even as far away as Hawaii. There was a time when a great part of the Scottish Highlands looked like this, the old Caledonian forest of fir and Scots pine, and then it was systematically felled over the years for houses, shipbuilding, fence posts, pit props, the lot, until it was all gone, and with it went this beautiful bird, the capercaillie, in Gaelic, the old man of the forest. Capercaillie is the biggest of the grouse tribe and by far the most handsome. And the capercaillies live entirely on pine shoots and pine needles. 150 years ago, they were extinct. Then in 1837, just 32 birds were brought over from Sweden and sent back into the woods again. And now they're beginning to thrive. Sometimes you hear them called the horse of the woods because of the clip-clop courtship call of the male to his many female admirers. But this gorgeous turkey-sized bird is not really an invader at all. He's a good British native that we were thoughtless enough to lose, and we lost him because we felled the trees and capercaillies can't live without them. But now there's a program of tree planting again. When you look at this fine-cocked bird with a harem that size, you can't help feeling that he's going to make a comeback. Let's hope he does. One last story, and a story with a curious twist. It's about a native British animal that went to invade somebody else's land. And this simple animal was our bumblebee. It happened this way. In New Zealand, at the end of the last century, the farming, the cattle farming and sheep raising was getting underway, and they needed clover for fodder. They had to import clover from Britain because there was none out there. But what they didn't realize was that every year they had to import more and more clover because it wouldn't last. The seed wouldn't set. There was not a native New Zealand insect